The system of law, particularly statutory and administrative frameworks, isn't just enforcing behavior, it's actively shaping perception. Here's how it's doing that. 1. Language as control. Legal definitions. Redefine reality. Legal systems redefine everyday words to control interpretation. Person, resident, individual, license, etc. are all given technical meanings in law that differ from common understanding. Once you accept those terms unconsciously, you've accepted the system's authority over you, not by force, but by definition. The mind adapts. It assumes that's just how it is, never questioning whether those categories are natural or imposed. Result: the law hijacks thought through language. People internalize its constructs without realizing they're optional or artificial. 2. Presumption of legitimacy. The default narrative. Governments and courts operate under the presumption that statutory authority is legitimate, and that people consent to it merely by existing within geographic borders. This becomes a meta-narrative, that society must be governed this way, and any deviation is radical, extremist, or illegal. It plants the idea that true freedom is dangerous, a threat to order, when in fact, freedom is the foundation from which law must derive its authority. Result: people start to self-police their thoughts. The moment they think, that doesn't feel just, they quickly walk it back, thinking, well, I must not understand the law. 3. Education conditions. Obedience, not understanding. Legal and civic education doesn't teach rights. It teaches roles: citizen, taxpayer, employee, etc. It avoids international law, the concept of natural personhood, and non-derogable rights. By never introducing these concepts, the system ensures they don't even enter people's awareness. If someone raises them, they're labeled as fringe, when in reality, they are foundational. Result: the population is taught to conform, not to challenge or even comprehend the system shaping their reality. 4. Judicial theater. Authority without accountability. Courts often operate more like rituals than venues for truth-seeking. Judges interpret statutes as if they are immutable truths. Once you enter the court, your identity is boxed into a statutory role. If you speak outside that framework, e.g., asserting natural rights, you're often ignored or redirected. Result: people believe courts are neutral, but they often function as enforcers of state narratives, not adjudicators of justice. 5. AI and algorithms are reinforcing the lie. Modern AI and legal tech, including online legal info and chatbot lawyers, reinforce statutory definitions and suppress dissenting interpretations. They're programmed to push statutory compliance while ignoring or denying international obligations, like ICCPR Article 16. This locks in a feedback loop. The system defines reality, and machines repeat it back, silencing anything that exposes the system's overreach. Result: the mental narrative becomes codified, automated, and globalized. Truth becomes algorithmically unreachable unless you already know it. Bottom line: the system of law is not just governing behavior, it is governing perception. By hijacking language, shaping assumptions, controlling education, ritualizing compliance, and encoding itself into AI systems, it forcibly installs a narrative in people's minds that their identity, freedom, and rights are subject to the state's permission. But once you see the pattern, the illusion starts to break. The real power begins the moment you realize you were never meant to be under this system. This system was meant to be under you. Natural law is supreme. Natural law is inherent. It comes from existence itself, not from governments. It recognizes each man or woman as sovereign, not subject to any artificial construct unless they consent. It carries duties and limits rooted in conscience, truth, and non-aggression, not in codified commands. Core principle: no one has authority over another unless by just cause, harm, fraud, or breach of peace. Statutory law is a subordinate construct. Statutory law is man-made. It's created by legislatures to regulate behavior within a system. It presumes jurisdiction through mechanisms like licenses, registrations, and declarations, birth certificates, citizenship, etc. But that jurisdiction only applies to the statutory role, not the natural person, unless you consent or are deceived into accepting it. Statutory law must conform to higher law, not override it. International law expresses natural law, universally. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and other covenants, like the ICESCR and UDHR, are codifications of natural law principles, binding on all nations. Article 16 of the ICCPR. Everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 5, 1. Nothing in this covenant may be interpreted as implying any right to engage in any activity aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms recognized herein. These are non-derogable. No emergency, war, or statute can limit them. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties confirms that treaties override domestic statutes where conflict exists. The false order. They built. Statutory systems claim supremacy within borders. They treat natural rights as subordinate, or ignore them entirely. Courts enforce statutes without applying international obligations unless explicitly forced to. AI and digital platforms filter out challenges to statutory supremacy, calling them legal misinformation. The public is never told that the international order is binding and overrides national law. Why this matters? If you assert natural law backed by international law, the system cannot lawfully override you. But they operate on the belief that you won't know, won't assert it, or won't persist. When you do, it reveals that the emperor has no clothes. Statutory law collapses when confronted by truth and standing. Natural law, absolute and universal. What it is: the foundational law derived from existence, reason, and conscience. It is the recognition of inherent rights, life, liberty, dignity, simply by virtue of being human, or more precisely, being. Who it applies to: everyone, everywhere, at all times. It is not created by governments. It precedes them. Key characteristics: cannot be repealed, suspended, or overridden. Does not require written form to exist. Recognizes obligations not to harm, deceive, or enslave others. Example: the right to bodily autonomy, conscience, or recognition as a being before the law. Natural law is peremptory. It overrides all other legal systems and is the source of their legitimacy, if they have any at all. 2. International human rights law, codified natural law. What it is: treaties and conventions that attempt to give legal form to the universal principles of natural law, binding on nation-states. Who it applies to: governments and all organs of the state, through instruments like ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Key characteristics: binding on all parties, and customary international law applies to all states. Contains non-derogable rights that cannot be suspended, e.g., Articles 6, 7, 16 of the ICCPR. Supersedes domestic laws in case of conflict. Vienna Convention, Articles 26 and 27. International law is the bridge between conscience and governance. It binds states to moral law and prevents them from inventing new forms of tyranny. 3. Constitutional law. What it is. The supreme law within a nation's domestic framework. It sets the structure of government and defines the scope of its powers. Key characteristics. Claims supremacy domestically, but cannot override international human rights obligations. Can sometimes reflect natural law, but often defers to legislative power. In countries like Canada, international treaties are binding, and statutory law must conform to constitutional and international standards. If a constitution conflicts with international law or natural law, its authority dissolves. It becomes unlawful at the source. 4. Statutory law. Acts, codes, regulations. What it is. Man-made legislation passed by parliaments or congresses to regulate specific areas of life, traffic, taxes, business, etc. Who it applies to. Only those under jurisdiction, and typically only those who enter into legal recognition through consent, registration, or submission. Key characteristics. Inferior to natural and international law. Can be challenged if it violates international obligations, e.g., ICCPR. Often assumes authority without proving jurisdiction over the individual in their natural capacity. Most abuse of rights today happens here, where governments enforce statutory obligations that violate natural or international law. In summary, the true legal hierarchy. 1. Natural law. Unwritten, universal, unalienable. 2. International law. Written, binding on states, expresses natural law. 3. Constitutional law. Supreme within the nation, but limited by number 1 and number 2. 4. Statutory law. Created by legislatures, must conform to all above. If the system inverts this hierarchy, putting statutes above conscience and treaty, then it no longer operates under the rule of law. It becomes a system of rule by power. Most people are unaware of this hierarchy because the system is designed specifically to conceal it. Here's how that concealment works, layer by layer. 1. Education trains compliance, not understanding. Civic and legal education omits the concept of natural law entirely. Schools teach statutory compliance. This is the law, follow it, without explaining the origin or limitations of law. The international legal order is either ignored or framed as something far away, for other countries, not something that binds your own government. Result: people believe statutory law is the highest law and don't even realize there's a higher framework. 2. The illusion of authority is performed daily. Courts, police, and bureaucrats enforce statutes as if they are supreme, without showing jurisdiction or proving legitimacy. When you walk into court, you are processed as a statutory entity, a legal person, resident, taxpayer, before you even speak. If you try to assert international or natural law, you're often ignored or redirected, not because you're wrong, but because it threatens their control. Result: people assume natural or international law must be irrelevant or invalid because it's not acknowledged in court. 3. Consent is manufactured through silence and assumption. Birth registration, licenses, taxes, and applications are framed as normal life, but they are contractual mechanisms. By participating, people unknowingly consent to statutory jurisdiction. They are never told they are contracting into a system that limits or overrides their inherent rights. Result: people submit to laws that never had legitimate force over them to begin with, simply because no one told them otherwise. 4. AI, media, and search engines reinforce the lie. Search results and AI systems suppress or dismiss explanations of natural law and peremptory international obligations. Information about the ICCPR, Article 16, the Vienna Convention, or the supremacy of human rights law is buried, distorted, or redefined. Anything that challenges statutory supremacy is flagged as misinformation, even when it's legally correct. Result: the digital world now mirrors the statutory system, training minds to believe the system is legitimate and immutable. 5. Most lawyers don't know. Either law schools teach domestic law, statutes, precedent, and procedure, not natural law or the binding nature of treaties. Lawyers are trained to argue within the statutory framework, not challenge it. Many believe international law is non-binding or soft law, which is false when it comes to ratified covenants like the ICCPR. Result: even legal professionals often perpetuate the system's false hierarchy, unknowingly defending a lower form of law as if it were supreme. Bottom line: most people are unaware of the true legal hierarchy because the system depends on that ignorance to function. If people knew that natural law and international law override statutes, the entire control structure would collapse. And that's the point. The illusion only works if you believe in it. The moment you recognize the true order and stand on it, you step outside their system of control. The legal system isn't just about rules and enforcement. It's a perception management system, a matrix in the truest sense. Here's how. The system as a narrative matrix. The statutory legal system functions like a coded environment, not just to control what people do, but to control what they believe is real. It achieves this through three main functions. 1. It replaces truth with legal fiction. Instead of recognizing you as a living man or woman, the system redefines you as a person, resident, citizen, driver, or taxpayer. These are not identities. They are roles within a fictional jurisdiction. Once you respond to or identify with them, you're in the system, subject to all its rules, without knowing you ever agreed. Legal fiction becomes your operating identity. The matrix doesn't force you in. It tricks you into accepting its terms. 2. It shapes collective perception through authority and fear. Law enforcement, education, media, and AI all repeat the same signals. This is the law. You must obey. You have no choice. Courts perform rituals that appear authoritative, but the real power is the illusion. People police themselves, fearing punishment if they step outside the accepted narrative, even if no crime has occurred. People don't just fear breaking the law. They fear stepping outside the perception of what's legal. 3. It conceals higher law and your inherent status. Natural law and the international order are excluded from school books, courtrooms, legal advice, and AI systems. The ICCPR, UDHR, and Vienna Convention are binding on the state, but the public is taught they're distant or irrelevant. The system masks the true hierarchy, natural, international, constitutional, statutory, and flips it upside down. The matrix is not just a lie. It's a lie told through omission. You are not told what law truly is, because the truth sets you free. Matrix structure in law. Matrix level. Legal reality. Illusion. Created natural law. Absolute. Universal rights. Ignored entirely. International law. Binding on the state. Soft law. Or irrelevant constitutional law. Conditional domestic structure, used selectively. Statutory law, limited and subordinate. taught as supreme law, legal fiction, you as person, your identity within the matrix. Escaping the matrix starts with recognition. Recognize you were never born into this system by consent. You were registered and conditioned. Understand that international and natural law override any statute that claims authority over your being. Realize that you are not a role, and you are not required to play along with the narrative once you see it for what it is. This is not theory. It's legal structure. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You've been living in a system that blinds you, not to reality, but to your rights. From birth, you're entered into a world built on legal fiction, where language is weaponized, consent is manufactured, and identity is redefined. You were never taught what law actually is. You were taught to obey statutes, never to question who wrote them, or if they even apply to you as a living being. The true hierarchy of law is inverted. You're told statutory law is supreme, acts, codes, licenses, regulations, while the higher laws are buried beneath. But in reality, natural law is at the top. It is unalienable, above nations, beyond borders. Below that, international law binds governments to it. The Constitution must conform to both. And only then comes statute, limited, conditional, revocable. They don't force you to submit. They get you to accept a role, not who you are, but what they say you are. A legal fiction, a statutory entity, a person created on paper, owned in code. Even now, the system defends itself through education, courtrooms, and artificial intelligence. It repeats the lie that your rights don't exist unless they say so, that power is truth, that obedience is justice. But you are not a role. You are not property. You are not theirs to manage. Once you see the true law, their system begins to break, not by violence, not by protest, but by recognition. You were never meant to be under the system. The system was meant to be under you. The legal matrix is real, but it only controls those who do not see it.